Bristol, 1695. The stink of the docks clung to everything. The barrels of salted fish, the sweating dock workers, the crooked-backed beggars choking on the river air. It smelled like rot and iron and old blood, and Edward Teach breathed it in like it was holy. He was a tall boy already, rough-handed and wiry from scrapping with older lads. His black hair hung in greasy clumps to his shoulders. In the evenings, he loitered with the other no-hopers near the taverns, brawling over pennies and stealing crusts from drunkards. His father, a sailor, had been lost to the sea years back, leaving Edward and his mother to the mercy of the city's slumlords. Mercy was in short supply. Edward learned quickly that fists spoke louder than pleas. If he was quick and cruel enough, he could eat. If he hesitated, he went hungry or worse. He learned to slip a knife into his boot by the time he was 10, and to use it by 12. He watched the ships with a hunger that gnawed his belly worse than any missed meal. Merchantmen from the Indies, privateers flying battered flags, whalers with their decks slick from gutting beasts bigger than houses. They all came and went, free in a way Edward could only dream of. One cold morning, after a beating that left his ribs bruised and his lip split, Edward sat on the end of the pier, feet dangling inches from the oily water. His mother had given up, sunk into gin and silence. No one in Bristol would miss a street rat if he disappeared. The thought did not sadden him. It set something alight in his gut. He wasn't meant to rot in the alleys of this God-forsaken city. He was meant for more. He was meant for the sea. Behind him, 2 sailors staggered from a tavern, laughing and bloody from some argument gone sour. They clapped each other on the backs, drunk on rum and the simple joy of having survived another fight. Edward turned to watch them. Their boots clattered on the uneven stones. Their swords swung at their hips. One wore a battered tricorn hat, the feather dangling limp and grimy. "That could be me," Edward muttered to the river. "That will be me." A hand closed on his shoulder. Reflex had him halfway out of his seat, knife flashing in the sun, before he registered the man looming over him. "Easy, lad," the man said, smiling through broken teeth. "You've got spirit. What's your name?" Edward hesitated. No one asked him that. Names were things you lost on the streets. "Edward," he said at last. The man chuckled. "Edward. Well, Edward, how'd you like to see the world?" Behind him, the ship creaked at anchor, her sails furled, her name, the Providence, painted in peeling white letters across her stern. Edward looked at the ship, then at the man. The decision was made before he'd even thought about it. "Aye," he said. The man grinned wider. "Welcome aboard, boy." The world lurched as the ship rocked, and Edward knew. His old life had ended. Whatever came next, he'd take it with both hands and never look back. The Providence was no merchant prince. She was a battered bark, patched and repatched, her rigging creaking like a dying man's bones. But to Edward, she was magnificent. His first days aboard were a blur of orders barked in thick accents, knuckles rapped for mistakes, and endless labour. Scrubbing decks, hauling lines, gutting fish for the officer's supper, all under the lash of the boatswain. A squat devil named Graves, who wielded a rope's end like a conductor's baton. Edward learned fast. He had to. Graves took a liking to breaking green boys, and he'd sooner lay you out bleeding than offer a second warning. Edward's back bled more than once, but he kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. He watched the older sailors, how they moved on the swaying deck, how they tied knots blindfolded, how they laughed in the face of storms. Nights were worse. Below decks was a stinking, heaving pit, Men snored, fought, and farted in the darkness, the air thick with sweat and bilge water. Edward slept with his knife tucked under his shirt, one hand on its hilt. He learned not to trust a smiling face. Smiles meant a trick, or worse. Better to keep your head down, your fists ready, and your wits sharper than your blade. Storms hammered them in the channel, great walls of black water smashing the deck. Men were swept overboard screaming, their cries snatched away by the howling wind. Edward clung to the rigging until his hands bled, teeth gritted against the terror clawing at his gut. Somewhere in that storm, something in him changed. Fear became anger. Anger became a kind of cold joy. When they limped into the port of Cadiz weeks later, Edward was no longer a street rat. He was a sailor. Cadiz was a world apart from the grey rot of Bristol. The air reeked of spices and hot tar. The streets teemed with merchants, soldiers and whores in bright skirts. Edward roamed wide-eyed on his rare shore leave, jostled by crowds, dazzled by colours he'd never imagined. At a tavern called the Bloody Star, he met men who spoke of stranger ports, Tortuga, Nassau, Havana, places where a man with steel in his hand and no fear in his heart could carve out a fortune or die trying. It was here, over mugs of sour wine and the reek of unwashed bodies, that Edward heard the first real talk of pirates. Not the bogeymen of English sermons, but real men, outlaws who laughed at kings and lived by no law but their own. The idea dug its claws deep. Back aboard the Providence, the work went on. More storms, more fists, more blood, a broken finger, a cracked rib, and always the hunger for something greater gnawed at him. One night, standing watch alone under a moon so bright it painted the deck in silver, Edward muttered to himself, "Not forever." The sea stretched endless and dark before him. Somewhere out there was the life he was meant for, and he would take it, no matter what it cost. The attack came at dawn, when the sea was flat and the wind slept. Edward was below deck, wrestling a leaking barrel into place, when the first cannonball ripped through the hull. The shock threw him hard against a beam, knocking the air from his lungs. Above, the ship erupted in chaos. Men screamed orders, muskets cracked. The scent of black powder and burning wood choked the air. Edward scrambled topside. What he saw snapped his world in two. A ship loomed alongside, close enough he could see the men grinning from her rails. Hard-eyed bastards with pistols tucked into belts, cutlasses drawn. Privateers, or worse. Grappling hooks flew. Lines bit into the Providence's masts and rails. The two ships slammed together with a sickening crunch of wood and iron. Then the boarders came. Edward's first kill was messy. A man came at him swinging a boarding axe. Edward ducked, stabbed wildly, and felt the knife punch into soft belly. Blood sprayed hot across his face. The man's mouth opened in surprise, a crooked grin that froze, then sagged as he toppled backwards. There was no time to think. More attackers flooded the deck. Pistols barked, blades flashed. Graves, the boatswain, fought like a mad dog, roaring and swinging a cutlass in wide, deadly arcs. He caught a boarder across the neck. Blood fountained. Then a pistol cracked and Graves spun, fell, and did not rise. Edward fought beside a gang of older sailors, trading blows, slipping in blood. His arms ached. His lungs burned. He didn't even notice when he took a slice across his shoulder, only that his shirt grew wet and sticky. The Providence's captain, a fat coward named Stillwell, tried to flee below decks. He didn't make it. A privateer gunned him down with a shot to the back. The fight turned quickly after that. With their officers dead or fled, the Providence's men broke, throwing down arms or leaping into the sea. Edward stood panting on the blood-slicked deck, knife in hand. As the last screams faded, he felt hollow, alive. A man in a battered green coat strode across the ruined deck, surveying the carnage. His beard was threaded with beads, his pistol belt heavy. "You fought," the man said, eyeing Edward. Edward nodded. Words were beyond him. The man grunted. "What's your name, boy?" "Edward." "Well, Edward," the man said, clapping a bloody hand on his shoulder. "Welcome to a better life." Behind him, men cheered as they stripped the Providence of valuables. Edward watched them work, efficient, brutal, laughing even as they stepped over the dead. This was no merchant crew, no pressed navy men. This was freedom, bought with blood. Edward smiled, teeth red with another man's blood. He had been baptized. The privateer ship was called the Vengeance, a sleek brigantine with black sails and a crew that answered to no king or governor. Edward became one of them, not by ceremony, but by survival. Within days, he learned the rhythm of piracy. Raid, plunder, vanish. The crew was a pack of wolves, vicious and laughing. If you fought well and took your share without complaint, you belonged. Edward fought better than most. Captain Vane, the man in the green coat, took notice. Vane was no soft-hearted leader. He ruled by fear and reward, a cut of gold, a bottle of rum, and the chance to live another day. Loyalty wasn't expected, only usefulness. Edward made himself useful. He fought like a man possessed, taking to the grappling and gutting of ship-to-ship combat with grim joy. He learned to fire a pistol, reload it in a storm, and throw a boarding hook through the teeth of a gale. The crew started calling him Devil's Son. A jest at first, because of the wild light in his eyes during a fight. The name stuck. By the time they reached the coast of Africa, Edward had blooded himself a dozen times over. Merchant ships crumpled under the Vengeance's guns. Their sailors surrendered or died screaming as the pirates flooded their decks. Once, when a Portuguese galleon refused to yield, Vane turned to Edward and growled, "Take her." Edward did. Leading a dozen men, he swung across on lines, pistols blasting, cutlass rising and falling. By the time the fighting ended, he stood atop the galleon's deck drenched in blood, not all of it his own, and roared into the sky like some mad beast. The prize was rich. Gold, spices, silk, enough to make the crew drunk for a month. Edward didn't care about the riches. He cared about the fire in his chest, the way men looked at him now, wary, respectful. He was no cabin boy, no deck swabber. He was becoming something else. Late one night, Vane called him to the captain's quarters. The room stank of tobacco and salt air. Charts were spread across the table. Bottles rolled with the ship's sway. Vane poured 2 mugs of rum, slid one across to Edward. "You got a devil in you, lad," Vane said, clinking mugs. "I see it. You could command your own deck, soon enough." Edward drank. The rum burned all the way down. He said nothing, but inside something grinned. Soon wasn't good enough. He wanted it all. It ended with a mutiny. Captain Vane's luck soured off the coast of Hispaniola. Bad weather, lost prizes, and food stores turning sour. Men grew restless and mean, whispered together in the dark, counted up the missed fortunes. The wayward tides of pirate loyalty turned like the sea, quick, merciless. Edward's time had come. One moonless night, when the Vengeance pitched sluggish in shallow waters, Edward, and a handful of trusted men cornered Vane in his cabin. The old captain was drunk, his pistols laid aside, his blade hanging idle on the wall, and a half-empty bottle of rum rolling lazily across the floor. Edward stood over him, knife glinting like a sliver of the moon. "Your time's done," Edward said, voice low and certain, cutting through the thick fug of sweat and tobacco smoke. Vane's eyes, once sharp as cut glass, clouded with rage and disbelief. He reached, too slow. Edward grabbed his wrist, twisted. Bones snapped with a wet pop. The crew poured in, swarming the old wolf, dragging him out like refuse. Vane didn't beg. He cursed Edward in 3 languages, spat blood and bile as they threw him onto a skiff and cut him adrift, alone in the ink-black sea, shouting promises of revenge that the waves swallowed whole. The vengeance was Edward's now. He didn't waste time. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a slap in the face to kings, queens, and every flag that had ever tried to tame the oceans. Then he remade himself. Gone was Edward Teach, street rat and hungry sailor. What rose in his place was something larger, darker, almost mythic. No one would forget him. No one would mistake him for anything but death sailing on 2 legs. He grew his beard long and wild, black as tar, twisting it into braids tied with crimson ribbons, a tangle of chaos and menace. In battle, he lit slow matches, sizzling fuses, and tucked them under his broad hat, so smoke wreathed his head like a demon sprung from hell itself. His men whispered new names for him. Some called him Devil Beard, others simply Blackbeard. He encouraged the rumours, played to them. He became an actor on a bloody stage, striding into battle a roaring, smoke-wreathed giant, swinging a cutlass in one hand and a pistol in the other. When they raided ships, he was the first to board, a blackened ghost bellowing through smoke, eyes burning bright, each step calculated to break hearts and make cowards soil themselves. Fear was his weapon, sharper than any cutlass, more reliable than a flintlock. Fear made men surrender without a fight. Fear made prizes fall into his lap, and he wielded it well. Below decks, the new Blackbeard set rules as brutal as any courts. Share the loot fair, fight like a devil, or be left behind in the dark sea. Loyalty bought another day of breathing. Failure bought a short rope and a long drop. Blackbeard laughed often, drank hard, and killed without flinching. His legend, born in Bristol gutters and hardened under Caribbean suns, was only just beginning to spread its black wings. The Queen Anne's Revenge was no mere ship. She was a floating fortress, a behemoth of iron and oak, bristling with guns and cloaked in the smoke of dread. Blackbeard spared no effort, no cruelty, in reshaping her into a weapon fit for a king of pirates. He doubled the guns, 40 cannon, each one a promise of death, ripped from captured prizes or bought with plundered gold. He reinforced her hull with thick timber, layering armour against the British Navy's shot. He widened her decks to allow for more men, more fire, more blood. Her figurehead, once a proud angel, was torn down and replaced with a demon, a black oak horror, mouth open in a scream that dared the ocean itself to defy her. Blackbeard ruled her as a tyrant and a prophet. His word was law, carved sharper than any sword. Dissent was not debated. It was cut out, thrown overboard, or strung up at the yardarm as a lesson. And yet, his crew, hard men from every gutter and gallows in the New World, followed him with a zeal that bordered on madness. They called her the Devil's Ship, from Havana to Charleston. Children whispered about her. Merchant captains dreamed of her and woke in cold sweat. Under her black flag, a skeleton spearing a bleeding heart, hourglass in hand, the Queen Anne's Revenge swept the shipping lanes like a plague. She moved with unnatural speed for her size, closing with fat merchantmen before they could pray. Her sails, darkened by smoke and salt, were a warning: surrender or face the fires of hell. Merchants often chose surrender. They would heave to, hands raised, holds thrown open, pleading for mercy that Blackbeard might, with a grin, grant or deny. Blackbeard's tactics were terror first, slaughter second. He staged his attacks like performances. He would fire a broadside into the sea, drench the air in smoke, light his slow matches so they hissed around his head, and stride the deck roaring oaths that seemed torn from the pit itself. If the ship resisted, he unleashed a fury few survived to describe. Cannonballs ripping through hulls, grappling hooks snagging flesh as well as wood, boarding parties howling and stabbing, deck turning to a butcher's yard within minutes. Edward, now fully Blackbeard, revelled in it. The boy from Bristol, the orphan scrounging scraps, had burned away. What remained was forged of smoke, blood, and fear. He armed himself like a one-man armory, 6 pistols slung across his chest, 2 cutlasses at his hips, a dagger in each boot. In battle, he was less a man than a walking arsenal, a nightmare brought to roaring life. He captured 12 prizes off Virginia and the Carolinas in one ruthless summer. He burned towns that dared to resist. He ransomed governors. He blockaded harbors for sport. His legend grew with every gunshot. Survivors, few and broken, spread the tales. The smoke-crowned demon who could not be killed. The ship that moved like death itself. At Nassau, pirates raised their mugs and cursed or praised his name depending on how drunk they were. Some claimed they had fought beside him. Others that they had seen him wrestle 3 men at once and gut them all. Governors put prices on his head so high they could have bought kingdoms. Merchant captains whispered prayers at every black sail glimpsed. Sailors deserted entire ships rather than face the Queen Anne's Revenge. She became a floating myth, a storm bottled in wood and iron, a nightmare that moved across the sea, answering only to the man who had torn his own name from history and replaced it with terror. And at her helm stood Blackbeard, laughing, roaring, immortal. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a kingdom of the damned, and its court was a snarling, blood-soaked brotherhood. Blackbeard's men were a collection of outcasts, murderers, deserters, and dreamers, all bound by one brutal code: loyalty to the captain, loyalty to the crew. The pirate code wasn't ink on parchment. It was written in blood on splintered decks and sealed with cutlasses in the gut. Disputes were settled with pistols at dawn or knives under the stars. Theft among brothers meant the lash, or worse, a slow keel-haul under the barnacle-encrusted belly of the ship. Cowardice was a death sentence. Betrayal was an art form with 1,000 ways to end badly. But for those who lived by the code, life under Blackbeard was a savage kind of freedom. Shares of plunder were divided fairly. Every man had a voice, though it was often drowned out by louder, drunker voices. New recruits could rise as fast as their nerve and skill allowed, or fall just as fast, left to rot in some nameless cove. They drank hard, fought harder, and laughed hardest when death came calling. Men like Israel Hands, an Englishman with murder in his eyes and a steady hand with a musket. Men like Tobias Knight, a quartermaster who could charm a snake or slit its throat for good measure. Blackbeard encouraged it all. The chaos, the camaraderie, the danger. It made his crew sharper, hungrier, It made them wolves who needed no leash, only the promise of blood and gold. They became a force that bled across the Caribbean, a black tide swallowing coastal villages, merchant fleets, and any fool stupid enough to cross them. Governors bribed them to stay away. Navy captains dreamed of them in fevered nightmares. Nights aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge were wild things. Bonfires roaring on the beaches of stolen islands, rum flowing in rivers, songs howled to the stars. Sometimes Blackbeard would stand above the firelight, his beard smoking, his pistols glinting in the dark, and tell tales so savage they froze the blood of even his hardest men. He spoke of kingdoms built from broken ships, of oceans ruled not by kings, but by men with the courage to seize their fate. He promised glory, gold, and freedom, and his men, drunk and bloody, believed him. In quieter moments, when the sea lay flat and the stars wheeled overhead, Ed would teach what little remained of him, wondered how long it could last, how many more bloody prizes, how many more betrayals from within and enemies from without, before the whole mad empire sank beneath the waves. But he always pushed the thought aside. Doubt was death, and death could wait. For now he had a brotherhood. For now he had a ship that cut the seas like a dagger through silk. For now he had the world by the throat, and he wasn't letting go. The Caribbean belonged to Blackbeard. From the Bahamas to the Spanish Main, his black flag was a curse whispered on every tide. Merchant captains altered their courses at the first rumour of his sails. Governors plotted behind their high stone walls, dispatching letters and ships with the desperate hope of ending his reign. Entire colonial towns would darken their ports and hide their wealth at even the vaguest rumour that Blackbeard was near. But it was Blackbeard's time, and the seas bent to his will. Throughout 1717, the Queen Anne's Revenge and her makeshift fleet pillaged with ruthless precision. Edward took what he wanted: sugar, tobacco, silk, spices, rum, gold. Anything that could be sold, traded, or devoured by his men. His crew grew rich and wild. Their pockets sagged with stolen coin. Their blades gleamed slick with the blood of fools who resisted. In Nassau, the pirate haven, Blackbeard ruled like an outlaw king. Drunken sailors stumbled over themselves to offer their blades and loyalty. Tavern keepers bowed deep, offering him the finest rooms and the strongest drink. Even the brothel madams, women as tough and cunning as any captain, gave nods of respect. Deals were struck in smoky backrooms over cracked maps and barrels of rum. Captains swore allegiance in blood, scarring their palms and shaking hands before roaring fires. Some gave their ships, others pledged crews. All wanted a piece of the fear Blackbeard inspired. By spring, he commanded over 300 hardened men and a dozen deadly ships, ranging from nimble sloops to captured men of war now flying black banners. The British crown, sluggish and distracted by wars across Europe, barely lifted a hand to stop him. The colonies, underfunded and undermanned, had no teeth to bare, only trembling hands and pleading letters. Edward laughed at them all. He sent mocking letters to the governors, sometimes accompanied by severed hands, ears or fingers, gory signatures of his contempt. He once ransomed an entire port town, locking the mayor and councilmen in their own stockades until ransoms were paid in barrels of gold, spices and brandy. He perfected the art of psychological warfare. His reputation often did the work before a cannon was fired. Tales grew taller with every retelling. Blackbeard riding storms as though he commanded the sea itself, Blackbeard dining on the hearts of captured captains, Blackbeard whose spirit no bullet or blade could kill. And Edward fed these myths with savage glee. He staged public executions of captured traitors, forcing them to dance on the air while the townsfolk watched, the corpses left swinging for days as warnings. He set captured ships ablaze after looting them, their flaming hulks drifting into harbours like ghostly funeral barges. Yet he wasn't all blood and fury. When it served him, he could be as smooth as silk, parleying with colonial officials, rich merchants, or even governors. He offered protection from other pirates for a price steep enough to make a bishop weep. Blackbeard could sip wine and flatter a lady at a governor's ball with the same ease he ripped a man's throat out when crossed. He built a network of informants, drunken sailors, corrupt officials, jealous mistresses. They fed him rumours, ship schedules, and whispered betrayals. Nothing moved through the Caribbean without Blackbeard eventually hearing about it. The Golden Age of Piracy was a feast, and Blackbeard sat at its blood-slicked head, carving up the world in slices of gold and horror. His name spread like wildfire across the Atlantic. London printers published fantastical tales of his cruelty and invincibility. Mothers threatened unruly children with the warning that Blackbeard would come for them. Even hardened sailors crossed themselves at the mention of his ship. For a time, it seemed the world itself might never catch up to him. But golden ages are fragile things. Even kings fall. Deep in the west, across jungled islands and shark-infested shoals, enemies gathered, quietly, hungrily. Colonial governors pooled bounties, and navies sharpened their blades. Plans were drawn, traps were baited. The sea had made Blackbeard a king. Now it would make him a legend, or a corpse. Blackbeard's reign was not built on plunder alone. It was built on fear, on loyalty bought and broken, on a brutal, calculated empire carved out of water and smoke. In the spring of 1718, he set his sights on the Carolinas. Edward understood that piracy could not survive on open water forever. The crown was waking up. Governors were sharpening their knives. If he wanted to outlast the coming storm, he needed something more than ships and gold. He needed a stronghold. He needed land. He needed to be a king. The plan was simple. Blockade the port of Charleston, South Carolina. Strangle it. Force it to its knees. Show the new world what Blackbeard's will could achieve. And so he did. With the Queen Anne's Revenge at the center, Blackbeard's fleet descended like vultures. They captured every ship entering or leaving the harbor, seizing supplies, passengers, even entire cargoes without a shot fired. Merchants panicked. Wealthy families barricaded themselves in their homes. The colonial governor, powerless and humiliated, sent envoys to beg Blackbeard for mercy. Edward demanded a king's ransom, a chest full of medicine for his ailing men. It was a lie, of course. He simply wanted to show he could take whatever he pleased, whenever he pleased. When the ransom was delivered, Blackbeard released his captives, naked, humiliated, and poorer than when they had been taken. He sailed away without spilling a drop of blood, his point made clearer than any broadside. Blackbeard was not just a pirate. He was a sovereign unto himself. Back at sea, the spoils rolled in. Sugar, gold, spices, slaves. He added more ships to his fleet, more desperate men to his ranks. His flotilla became a floating kingdom, answerable to no nation, loyal only to the man with smoke in his beard and hell in his heart. Yet ruling pirates was like ruling a pack of rabid dogs. They were loyal while the gold flowed and the victories mounted. But pirates could smell weakness like sharks smelled blood. And cracks had begun to show. Some captains grumbled that Blackbeard was hoarding too much of the treasure. Others whispered that he grew cautious, too interested in deals and politics, not enough in blood and plunder. The wild spirit that had made him a legend was beginning to turn on itself. Edward heard the whispers. He saw the glances. He knew the tides were shifting. He made a decision. He would retire, at least for a time. Accept a royal pardon. Slip into respectability long enough to outwit the noose tightening around the Caribbean's throat. He sailed to Bath, North Carolina, and negotiated a pardon with Governor Charles Eden. Land grants were discussed, titles hinted at. A new life dangled before him, glittering and hollow. For a few short weeks, Blackbeard, Edward Teach, was a landowner, a respectable man. But the sea called louder than any promise of peace. Edward took to piracy again, under the governor's nose, under a thin veneer of legitimacy. He bribed officials, traded secret cargoes, played both sides against the middle. He had traded his black sails for finer clothes, his open warfare for whispered deals. But he was still a tyrant, still a king. Only now the crown he wore was invisible and far more dangerous. Behind the civility, behind the letters and titles, the old Blackbeard simmered, waiting for the right moment to set the world aflame again. And across the waters, hunters gathered. They were coming for him. He knew it. He welcomed it. By the summer of 1718, Blackbeard's fleet moved like a spectre across the Atlantic, a black stain on the seas that no nation dared to scrub away. The Queen Anne's Revenge led the procession, flanked by smaller sloops and brigs, ships taken, battered, and remade in Blackbeard's image. Their sails were patched, their hulls scarred, but each bore the black flag high and proud. They flew different designs, skeletons, hourglasses, bleeding hearts, yet all told the same truth. Death was coming. To the sailors of the Caribbean, it became legend, the Ghost Fleet. They appeared at dawn, sails catching the first bloody light, emerging from mistbanks as if conjured by witchcraft. They struck swiftly, ruthlessly, then vanished before colonial navies could respond. Merchants spoke of ships that came out of nowhere, harried them like wolves, and vanished before help could even be summoned. The fear spread faster than the fleet itself. Captains abandoned cargo at the first sign of black sails, choosing survival over honor. Port cities fortified their harbors. Town criers warned citizens to stay indoors when the black flags came near. In taverns from Kingston to Charleston, drunken captains swore they had seen the ghost ships glide across the water without wind, their black banners snapping in the still air. Some claimed to have heard the creak of their rigging at midnight, even when they were safe ashore. Blackbeard encouraged the superstition. He kept the fleet moving constantly, changing course, splitting up and rejoining, making it seem there were twice, thrice their actual number. No one knew where he would strike next. No one could predict the movements of a ghost. Meanwhile, Blackbeard grew rich beyond the dreams of avarice. Holds groaned with treasure, barrels of sugar, chests of Spanish silver, stacks of silk and rum. His men drank deep and lived fast, knowing full well their end would come with iron or hemp. It wasn't only fear that kept the fleet together. It was belief. Belief in Blackbeard's invincibility. Belief that no British warship, no colonial governor, no man alive could bring them down. He was their shield, their sword, and their nightmare. But belief is fragile. The Ghost Fleet suffered its first real blow near Beaufort Inlet. The Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground. Blackbeard had been pushing hard, steering the ship into unfamiliar, treacherous waters. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered it was deliberate, that Blackbeard, ever cunning, sought to reduce his following to a more loyal core. that he was tired of managing a small empire of cutthroats and wanted to burn away the dead weight. Whatever the truth, the flagship was lost. The hull splintered on the reef, the masts cracked like dry bones. Blackbeard and a few trusted men salvaged what they could, abandoning the wreck before the sea swallowed her whole. Men cursed and cried as they watched the great ship vanish beneath the surf. The Queen Anne's Revenge, once the terror of 2 continents, now lay broken beneath the waves. Another ghost added to the fleet's legend. Blackbeard took the loss in stride. He gathered a smaller crew, the fiercest and most loyal, and set out again aboard a sloop, lighter, faster, deadlier. With fewer mouths to feed and fewer enemies close at hand, he became more dangerous than ever, a scalpel instead of a hammer. He no longer sought to build an empire. He sought survival. The Ghost Fleet fragmented. Some captains went their own way, some were captured, some vanished into the jungles and brothels of the New World. Betrayals multiplied. Greedy men with gold in their hands and fear in their hearts turned to save themselves. But Blackbeard remained, lean, mean, and more vicious than before. If the world wanted a ghost, he would give them one. A ghost that haunted their nightmares. A name that clung to the corners of every sailor's mind long after the last black sail vanished into the mist. Blackbeard was no longer a king of pirates. He was a legend, a wraith, an omen. And legends, once born, are damned hard to kill. Blackbeard's retreat from empire building didn't mean retreat from violence. If anything, the Carolinas burned hotter with his fury than anywhere else. Operating out of Ocracoke Inlet, Blackbeard turned the Outer Banks into his personal hunting grounds. It was perfect country for a pirate. Shallow shoals, hidden coves, twisting channels that trapped heavy warships like rats. He knew the waters like a shark knew blood, and he used them. Small towns up and down the Carolina coast lived in terror. Blackbeard's sloop, fast and lean, slipped out of the fog at dawn, struck hard, and vanished before a musket could be fired in anger. Farmhouses burned. Ships vanished from their moorings. Fishermen found their nets slashed, their boats adrift, and their sons missing. Sometimes he took what he needed, food, powder, rum. Other times he took just to remind them he could. He forged uneasy alliances with corrupt officials. Governors turned blind eyes, fattened by gold and fear. Merchants paid tribute, whispering prayers they didn't truly believe in. But the violence was never random. Blackbeard waged war with the cold logic of a general. Each raid sent a message: I am still here. I am still king. Blood ran in the streets of Beaufort, where Blackbeard's men dragged a magistrate from his home and forced him to sign false papers authorizing their cargo. In Bath, a dozen colonial militia lay dead, ambushed on a moonless night and buried in shallow graves by the roadside. Rumors spread like plague. Blackbeard had magic, they said. Bullets couldn't kill him. He could raise storms with a curse. His ship could sail across dry land. His men, half drowned, half mad, could tear a man limb from limb just for looking at them wrong. The fear worked. Blackbeard grew stronger, not weaker, after the loss of the Queen Anne's Revenge. His enemies found themselves paralyzed, uncertain whether to fight, flee, or simply pray they were ignored. But every empire, even one of smoke and blood, leaves enemies in its wake. Across the waters in the colonial capitals, the anger boiled over. Merchants who had paid and paid again now demanded action. Governors, embarrassed by their own cowardice, called for vengeance. And behind closed doors, powerful men plotted. They whispered names: Maynard, Spotswood, hunters with sharp blades and sharper ambitions. Blood had watered the Carolinas. Now it would draw predators. Blackbeard didn't fear them. He was ready. The game was nearing its end. But he intended to go out the way he had lived, laughing in the face of death, with blood on his hands and smoke in his beard. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia had had enough. While other governors cowered behind their fortifications, signing treaties and offering gold to be spared, Spotswood sharpened his ambitions and readied his knives. Blackbeard had humiliated the crown one time too many, and Spotswood saw an opportunity, a chance to destroy a legend and cement his own legacy. He called for Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a rising officer in His Majesty's Navy known for his iron discipline and quiet ruthlessness. To Maynard, Spotswood made an offer. Take down Blackbeard and rise. There would be no grand battles, no parades of honor, just a bloody secret war. Maynard would sail 2 small sloops, stripped of heavy cannons to ride low and fast through the shallow waters where Blackbeard hid. His force would be lean, no more than 60 hand-picked men, armed with muskets, pistols, and cutlasses sharpened to a razor's edge. No second chances. The plan was simple. Catch Blackbeard unaware at Ocracoke Island, where rumors said he drank and feasted, believing himself untouchable. The ships were readied under false pretenses, supplies gathered in hushed tones, orders written in secret, no declaration of war, no letters of marque, only a bounty. Maynard drilled his men relentlessly, no firing broadsides, no duels across decks. This would be knife work, hand to hand, face to face. They practiced storming over rails, boarding with cold efficiency. Each man knew he was risking death or worse, but the promise of gold and glory held them firm. Meanwhile, Blackbeard felt the storm in his bones. Something was coming. The sea spoke to him in the way it always had. Shifting winds, strange silences, the taste of metal in the salty air. His dreams were restless, filled with blood and fire. He drank more. He laughed harder. But in the dead of night, alone at the rail, he stared into the black water and listened. He tightened his circle, trusted fewer faces. He ordered his men to sleep lightly, blades close at hand. His best fighters, Israel hands among them, kept their pistols loaded and ready even when they drank. At Ocracoke, he anchored in the shallows, his sloop, the Adventure, sitting lazy and low in the morning mist. He entertained guests, other pirates, smugglers, a handful of traitorous officials who liked to whisper of gold and futures. They drank, they schemed, but Blackbeard never let his guard drop completely. The inlet was perfect for defense. Narrow, rocky, twisting channels where no heavy warship dared follow. It was, in Blackbeard's mind, the one place he could not be touched. He was wrong. In the early hours before dawn, Maynard's sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, slipped silently into the inlet, oars muffled, sails dark. They rowed slowly, silently, the men barely daring to breathe. The trap was set with careful, merciless hands. At sunrise, Blackbeard's lookout spotted the approaching vessels. The alarm went up. Men scrambled for weapons. Pistols were loaded. Powder kegs dragged to the rail. Blades flashed in the growing light. Blackbeard stood at the rail, his face breaking into a feral grin. He had 30 men. Maynard had 60. Blackbeard didn't care. He tied the slow-burning fuses of his matches under his hat, letting the smoke curl around his head like a devil's crown. He strapped pistols across his chest until he clanked with iron. At his side hung a heavy cutlass, worn smooth by years of killing. He turned to his men, rough men, killers and thieves, every one of them, and roared, "Ready the guns. We'll send them to the depths." Across the water, Maynard's men loaded muskets, grit their teeth, and whispered final prayers. Maynard stood at the prow, hand tight on the hilt of his sword, eyes locked on the smoke-shrouded figure waiting for him. No mercy, no quarter. Both sides knew the sea would drink blood before the sun climbed high, and Blackbeard, smiling through the smoke, intended to give it a feast. The first volley shattered the morning calm. Blackbeard's sloop roared with cannon fire, smoke belching across the narrow water. The shot smashed into Maynard's approaching sloops, sending splinters and men flying. Screams tore the mist apart, the acrid smell of burning powder stinging every nose. But Maynard had prepared for this. He kept most of his men hidden below decks, the sloops appearing crippled, vulnerable. Blackbeard, seeing the decks littered with the dead, ordered the boarding, confident in his advantage, eyes gleaming with the promise of slaughter. Blackbeard's men, roaring with bloodlust, swung grappling hooks, hauled the sloops close and charged. They hit the decks with a fury born of desperation, cutlasses hacking, pistols barking, boots slipping in fresh blood. Their howls mixed with the clash of steel, the slap of bodies hitting the planks, the cries of the wounded. And then Maynard's trap snapped shut. From below, Maynard's hidden marines erupted upward, muskets blazing at point-blank range. Blackbeard's first wave staggered under the sudden onslaught, confusion and terror flashing in their eyes. A few turned to flee. They were gunned down where they stood. Blackbeard waded into the fray, a black demon wreathed in smoke, pistols flashing, cutlass cleaving through flesh and bone. Blood slicked his boots, but he never stumbled. Maynard fought his way forward through the melee, blade clashing against blade, musket butts cracking skulls, the deck a maelstrom of chaos. Men fought like animals, clawing, biting, stabbing, each knowing there would be no quarter given. Blackbeard and Maynard saw each other across the carnage. They came together like storms colliding, steel shrieking as swords met with bone-jarring force. Blackbeard fired a pistol at point-blank range. Maynard ducked, feeling the heat of the shot graze past his scalp. Maynard slashed low, aiming for Blackbeard's gut, but the pirate twisted, parried, countered with a brutal swipe that nicked Maynard's ribs. The decks ran red. Bodies sprawled over blood-slick planks. Smoke and sweat filled the air, choking lungs, blinding eyes. Screams blended with the groan of wounded wood, the sea lapping hungrily at the blood that spilled into her. Blackbeard fought like a man who could not die. He took shot after shot. By the end, 5 musket balls and 20 cuts riddled his body. And still he fought, roaring curses, swinging his blade with savage strength. His beard smoked from the slow-burning fuses tucked beneath his hat, making him look like some infernal wraith refusing to yield. Maynard drove his sword into Blackbeard's neck. Blood sprayed hot and bright. Blackbeard staggered, dropped to one knee, and lunged again, slashing Maynard's shoulder open to the bone. The lieutenant screamed but held his ground, parrying another savage blow. It took a circle of Maynard's men, hacking and stabbing, to bring him down. Even then, legend said, Blackbeard's body fought for a moment longer after his head was severed, the smoke-maddened corpse swinging blindly before collapsing into the gore-slick deck. The sea, ever greedy, lapped at the blood, the bodies, the broken dreams strewn across the shattered sloops. The Battle of Ocracoke was over. Blackbeard was dead. His head was taken, spiked on Maynard's bowsprit, as a grim trophy. a warning to all who still clung to lawlessness. His body, weighted and dumped into the churning waters, vanished beneath the waves he had once ruled. But in the silent, stunned aftermath, every man, friend and foe alike, knew the truth. Blackbeard had not been killed. He had been unleashed. His legend, born of smoke and steel and blood, would never die. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, the sea still whispered his name. The morning after Ocracoke was a graveyard. Wreckage bobbed on the tide, broken spars, shattered oars, torn sails, and bodies drifting face down like rotten buoys. Blood slicked the water, painting the waves crimson. Silence hung heavy over the inlet, broken only by the gulls circling hungrily overhead, their cries slicing through the mist like knives, as if mourning and feasting in the same breath. Maynard's men moved stiffly, staggering across the blood-soaked decks, gathering their wounded, binding gaping wounds with strips torn from bloodied shirts. Some wept openly, grief and terror breaking through their hardened exteriors. Others stared blankly at nothing, hands trembling uncontrollably, minds lost to the horrors they had witnessed. Blackbeard's head, grotesque and defiant even in death, was lashed to the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop. His beard still smoked faintly, the last of the slow matches burning down to ash. His lifeless eyes, locked in a final expression of fury and contempt, seemed almost to follow the living, cursing them with every frozen stare. But Blackbeard's true final stand hadn't ended with his death. The echoes of his life rattled through every port, every alley, every ship's deck across the Atlantic. Sailors spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. Some claimed to see his ghost at the wheel of a phantom ship on storm-tossed nights, its black sails cutting the lightning-streaked sky. Others swore they heard his laughter carried on the wind, mocking death itself, a grim symphony for those who dared to cross the seas. Maynard delivered the head to Governor Spotswood, who paraded it through the streets of Virginia like a savage trophy. It was displayed on a pike at the mouth of the river, a grotesque beacon meant to warn pirates and rebels alike. But even in triumph, Spotswood felt the unease. The people did not cheer as loudly as expected. There was fear and awe etched deep into their faces. Because Blackbeard was never just a man. He was a force, a myth, a living curse upon the waters. And myths do not die easy. In taverns and in the dark corners of shipyards, men still whispered his name with a mixture of dread and respect. They remembered the fire in his eyes, the smoke coiling from his hat, the fearless roar as he led his men into the jaws of death. They spoke of the nights when his ship seemed to materialize from the mist, black sails billowing, cannons roaring like the wrath of gods. Parents warned their children, "Mind your manners or Blackbeard will come for you." Sailors crossed themselves when the wind howled too hard at night, fearing that his spirit still roamed the waters, hunting for vengeance. Wives lit candles at their windows, hoping to ward off the black shadow that could slip ashore without warning. Old mariners, half drunk on rum and regret, spun tales of meeting him in the afterlife, where he commanded a fleet of ghost ships, plundering the souls of the damned, sailing into the endless blackness beyond death, still laughing, still defying the world. And the sea, endless and ancient, seemed to keep a piece of him, as if unwilling to let him go completely. Storms broke without warning near Ocracoke. Ships vanished without a trace, and always the name Blackbeard was whispered like a prayer and a curse. In the end, Blackbeard's last stand was not a place. It was not a battle. It was a legacy carved into blood, fear, and salt. His name became a storm unto itself, a shadow cast over every man who dared hoist a black flag and defy a king. A warning to those who would dream too big, live too wild, and dare to spit in the face of empires. The devil of the sea was dead, but the storm he unleashed would rage forever, hammering against the shores of the known world, a savage reminder that freedom bought with blood was a freedom few could truly tame. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the deep black water, the echoes of his laughter still rolled like distant thunder, a challenge to every soul who ever dared to sail beyond the edge of the map. Legends never sleep. They only wait for the next fool brave enough to chase them. Blackbeard was dead. His body fed the crabs in the dark currents. But his legend, his true weapon, thrived. Across the Atlantic, news travelled faster than any ship. Tales of the Battle of Ocracoke and the man who would not die exploded like wildfire through taverns, trading posts, and royal courts alike. In the cities of Europe, playwrights staged dramatizations of his last stand. Pamphleteers inked lurid descriptions of his ghostly final moments. In London, children wore makeshift black beards at festivals, daring each other to be Blackbeard for a day. Among sailors, though, the stories were different. They said Blackbeard's ghost still roamed the high seas, that when thick fogs rolled over the water and your compass spun uselessly in your hand, it was because the devil of the sea was near. Some swore they heard the crack of his boots across the deck at night. Others whispered they had glimpsed the blackened sails of the Queen Anne's Revenge, rising out of storms that had no natural cause. His legend mutated, grew monstrous. He became larger in death than he had ever been in life, a spirit of chaos and defiance, a symbol of rebellion against all crowns and chains. In the New World, pirate crews still raised black flags, invoking his name as both shield and sword. Captains toasted to Blackbeard before raids. Mutineers painted his image on their sails. Even merchants and navy men, hardened killers themselves, dared not speak ill of him without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Governors issued new proclamations, outlawing the telling of pirate stories in public taverns. They banned the showing of plays that glorified Blackbeard. They even tried to wipe his name from records. It was useless. The harder they fought to bury him, the deeper his legend dug into the bones of the world, in the heart of the Caribbean, in the narrow straits and deep coves where the law still dared not tread. Young men whispered oaths under the stars, dreaming not of king's favour, but of Blackbeard's ghost, blessing their sails. Freedom, after all, had a cost. It was paid in blood, terror, and defiance. Blackbeard had paid it in full, and his shadow stretched long over every ship that dared defy the order of the world. Years passed. Empires rose and fell. The sea remained. And sometimes, when the mist rolled thick and the waves slapped against a ship's hull with a sound almost like laughter, an old sailor would shudder and cross himself. Because some storms, once unleashed, never truly end. And some names like Blackbeard, live forever, stitched into the fabric of the endless, hungry sea.